welcome to another episode of Justice on Trial. Today I'm joined by Professor Philippe Sands, international lawyer, barrister of Matrix Chambers, and author of the award-winning West Street. His work has helped define how we understand crimes like genocide and shape the future of international law. Okay, so thank you so much for joining me today on on a new episode, especially about environmental law and international law. Would you maybe like to start with explaining how you got into your specific field of law?
Sure. Sure. So I was a school kid like everyone else who's probably listening. We had a great economics teacher at school, Mr. Burke, and he had a big impact on our lives. When we were 15, he got the school van and drove us up from London to Yorkshire to go down a coal mine. And that had a big effect on my life. And I decided I wanted to do economics at university, and I got into university to do economics. And then once I got to university, I thought the teaching of it was really boring, and I changed to law, which basically was a big mistake because it was even worse than economics, except for one class. We had a lovely teacher of international law, Professor Jennings, and I loved his classes, and they seemed to connect, and I got really interested in international law, perhaps because my mum was from abroad, had been a refugee as a child, and so the international law stuff seemed interesting, and that opened my interest in international law. And then I stayed on for an extra year and I did a master's in international law, and then my legal career took off. I actually had a girlfriend at the time, and I went off to America to stay with her and would pop into the local university and go to the international law lectures. And then out of the blue, I got a letter from my teacher at university, Mr. Lauterpacht, and he said, "I'm setting up a new centre for international law. Would you like to apply for the job?" And that was what I did, and amazingly, I got the job, and at the age of 23, I was up and running doing international law. That's how it started.
Oh, wow. So not a direct path into law, but later switching into it. That always shows you can always find yourself back into law, and it always maybe is always not a direct path. Okay, so
Yeah, the advice that I give is, I mean, well, and I wouldn't give anyone advice, but what I did was I just followed my instincts. I followed what I found interesting and what I liked, and it led me to a good place.
I think that's always follow your gut feeling and see what you like, and then just that path. Definitely more people should listen to that. So staying on international law, so your legal career has taken you right to the center of global justice, from Nuremberg legal legacies to real-world cases at the International Court of Justice. So most of us hear international law and think of something quite distant, courts in different countries, men in suits making laws. So what would you say is international law at its core, and who is it really for?
Well, when I first studied international law, it was men in suits. It was all white men. There were no women involved. There were no people of color involved. At least that's how it was presented to us. And then, of course, as I got out into the world, I came to see that the world was rather different. And there were many people involved from all sorts of backgrounds and all sorts of different parts of the world. And I would get to know some of those people and some of those characters. And my first beginnings in the field of international law, well, I was hired by Mr. Lauterpacht, and he got me a job as a research fellow at his centre in the University of Cambridge. And I did research on disputes between private companies and governments, where the companies argued that the governments of the countries had interfered with their investments. But then my life took a very different turn in April 1980. I remember it really well. There was a series of newspaper reports that there had been some sort of nuclear accident in the Soviet Union. And very soon we got all these reports about radiation clouds coming across Europe and around the world. And then I got asked to give a paper on what was then called transboundary air pollution, where you have a major accident in one country and it spews sort of radionuclides all across Europe and across the world. The question arose, what were the rules of international law on that? And I got invited to give a talk at a conference in Washington, D.C. in America. And I said to Mr. Lauterpacht, well, I don't know anything about this. And he says, no one knows anything about this. It was the new world of environmental law and transboundary pollution. So I did a bit of research, went off to Washington, had a great time. And the paper that I wrote got turned into a book. And my first book was on the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Some of you may have seen the fantastic TV series on Chernobyl. It's really worth watching. Having written that book on Chernobyl and international law, non-governmental organizations, NGOs, started getting in touch with me to give legal opinions. I remember I got one from Greenpeace on catching whales in the southern Antarctic and whether that was a violation of international law, and other things about nuclear power plants on the Irish Sea. And my career got up and running, and that was literally how it started. So my first areas were on the environment and on damage caused by transboundary pollution, environmental harms. And I've done that ever since. For 40 years, I've been involved in that.
Oh, so you always have kind of like had time with environmental law and then focus more on it later in your department of Ecocide, which we'll get on to later a bit more. So can you walk us through a case, because you've had quite a few famous cases in international law, where you saw international law actually change something on the ground in achieving maybe justice or real life people?
Yeah, I mean, when people often ask me what are the one or two cases that really made a difference, I mean, I've been very lucky. So I also, again, at the instigation of Mr. Louterbat, he said, oh, it's not good enough just to be a teacher and a researcher. You need a professional qualification. You must become a barrister. And I didn't know any barristers. I didn't know any solicitors. I didn't know any lawyers. I mean, I come from a background. My dad was a dentist. My mum ran a little bookshop in London. We didn't know any lawyers. But he helped me qualify as a barrister. I went that route basically because it was quicker. It was only 2 years instead of 3 years. And then I started getting cases. And over the years, as you say, I've been really lucky. I've got to do many, many cases that are very interesting on the environment, on international crimes, on these kinds of things. If I'm asked about the two cases that touched me the most, I have no hesitation. The first one was in 1998. And it was the case involving the former dictator from Chile, Augusto Pinochet, who left office in 1990, had been responsible, his regime, for torturing and killing and disappearing people. And after he left office in 1998, he decided to visit the United Kingdom. Mrs. Thatcher was his friend. He'd helped Britain on the Falkland Islands issue. And while he was here, he was arrested on the basis of an arrest warrant issued from Spain by a Spanish judge called Balthazar Garzon, asking for him to be sent by extradition to Spain to be tried for crimes against humanity and genocide. And the argument that he made, or his lawyers made, was that he had an immunity from the English courts, that everything he had done had been done by him in his official capacity as the leader of Chile, as the president of Chile. And for those acts, he was immune under international law. That meant the English courts could not exercise jurisdiction over him, could not force him to appear before them to hear this extradition request. So he brought that case. I've written about this in my latest book, which just came out a couple of months ago, 38 Londres Street. I ended up acting against General Pinochet for an organization called Human Rights Watch. And we argued, along with Amnesty International and with the Spanish judges, that he was not entitled to immunity. And the first judgment came down in November 1998, Pinochet judgment, and you can watch it on the BBC website. It's an amazing moment where the House of Lords judges ruled that a former head of state does not have immunity for the crime of torture because it is prescribed by international treaty. And so he had no immunity. This was a huge moment. When the judgment came down, you literally hear a gasp in the room. So that was a huge moment because it was the first time in history that a former head of state had been found to be subject to the jurisdiction of the courts of another country for international crimes. So that was 1998. And then 20 years later, in February 2019, I had been involved in a case for the government of Mauritius against the United Kingdom, in effect, concerning a place called the Chagos Archipelago. Chagos was part of the British colony of Mauritius, but when Mauritius gained independence in 1965-68, the British government decided that it wanted to keep some of the islands of Mauritius, called the Chagos Archipelago, and it did that, and it removed the entire population. And then it basically created a new colony called the British Indian Ocean Territory. And many years later, in 2010, I was hired by the government of Mauritius to bring cases against the United Kingdom's exercise of claimed sovereignty over the Chagos Archipelago. And in February 2019, an advisory opinion, as it's called, the International Court of Justice ruled that the United Kingdom did not have sovereignty over Mauritius, over Chagos Archipelago, that the territory of the Chagos Archipelago had been dismembered illegally in 1965, that Chagos had always been part of the territory of Mauritius, and that the Chagossians could go back, all the people who'd been removed from the islands. So this was a major issue of human rights and decolonization law and so on and so forth. And these two cases make it clear to me that those who say, oh, international law can't make a difference, it's useless, blah, blah, blah. No, I mean, there are cases that are very difficult. We're seeing what's going on in the world now in Russia and Ukraine and Israel, Palestine and Gaza and Sudan and other places. But actually, there are enough cases where a difference is made. And that's what gives me hope. And it's why your generation is so important going forward, to continue fighting for the principles and values of international rules.
I 100% agree. I think right now, especially in the media, we see a lot of international justice being questioned. But I think those kind of revolutionary cases really portray that there's hope. So, as you kind of touched on a bit on the difficulties on international justice, can you describe a time when the law should have worked, but maybe it didn't, or you faced some challenges throughout cases?
Well, if you take a case that I'm very involved in now, what's happening in Ukraine, in February, 2022, Russia announced what it called, in the words of President Putin, a special military operation to basically occupy the whole of Ukraine. And in my view, and I think in the view of many people and many governments, that was a plain violation of international law. And international law did not stop that from happening. It was the first, massive use of armed force, contrary to international law, in Europe since the Second World War. And that was very dispiriting. We thought those times were over. We thought the rules in the UN Charter, in Article 2, Paragraph 4, which said you can't use force in international relations, had stopped this kind of thing, but plainly they haven't. And we see a similar situation right now in relation to the relations between Israel and Palestine and Gaza. And there was a terrible act of October the 7th, 2023, people being killed, real crimes under international law. And then the response, led by Hamas, let's not beat about the bush. And then the response by Israel, more crimes under international law, what's happening in Gaza and, killing of civilians and children and targeting of doctors and so on and so forth. So I'm not starry-eyed about international law. I know that it's not perfect. I know that it doesn't work all of the time. But basically, it's all we've got. It's what stands between us and autocracy and authoritarianism, and I support it.
Perfect. Well, I think a world without international law would look a lot worse than it is now. So you kind of touched on often like more powerful states using international law. So some critics argue international law is just victor's justice written by those most influential and powerful states. Would you say there's maybe any truth in that?
Well, I think when people refer to that, they're often thinking about the Nuremberg
Yeah.
Tribunal, the famous trial that started in November 1945 in Nuremberg in Germany when 22 Nazis, senior Nazis, were put on trial for crimes committed during the Nazi regime. And I think it's difficult to escape the conclusion that that was, yes, indeed, a form of victor's justice in which only the crimes of one side were tried and acts of wrongdoing by the other side, including, I'm thinking of the bombing of Dresden or use of nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were not subject to the jurisdiction of any court. So I think, that was the moment of creation when the new international rules were established, new rules alongside war crimes, new crimes like crimes against humanity and genocide, That's the protection of individuals and the protection of groups, and what was then called crimes against peace, today the crime of aggression. These were all put in place, and yes, they were victors' justice, and yes, ever since, the international courts have struggled to, if you like, catch the big fish. We're seeing a change. In the last couple of years, we've had indictments of Mr. Putin, of Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council. We've had indictments of Hamas leaders, but also of Israeli leaders. And so there is an effort to move away from lopsided justice. But it's tough because law and politics do go hand in hand. And so I expect the struggle will be long and complicated going forward.
I can imagine so too. Okay, so let's move on to something more recent of your work, Ecocide, because justice doesn't just stop with people. In recent years, you've helped pioneer a bold new legal definition for ecocide. So could you explain maybe to those who aren't legal experts what ecocide is?
So what you need to understand, and I think you know this, under international law since 1945, there have been 4 international crimes: war crimes, crimes against humanity, the protection of individuals, genocide, the protection of groups, and the crime of aggression. And all of those focus, for very good reasons, on the protection of humans. There's a big gap. The protection of the environment as an end in itself. There are some limited rules. You can't use the environment to harm humans, for example, in war crimes law, but maybe also to a certain extent crimes against humanity. But there's no international crime of massive harm to the environment. This first came up actually as an idea in the late 1960s against the background of the Vietnam War, when some American sociologists started talking about something called ecocide, massive and systematic damage to the environment. It was mentioned in the opening session of the famous United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in 1972, held in Stockholm. And over the years, many, many people have argued for it. There was a very wonderful English barrister called Polly Higgins, who, starting in the 2000s, began to really push. She'd been a corporate lawyer, and then she said, no, that's not what I want to do. I want to work on the environment, and I want to push the crime of ecocide. And she made great strides with a non-governmental organization, which you can join, called Stop Ecocide, the massive destruction of the environment. And in 2020, I think it was, I was contacted by that NGO, Stop Ecocide, because of my background in the environment that we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, because I'd done cases on crimes against humanity and genocide, like the Pinochet case and other cases. They thought I was well placed to chair a working group. In the end, I said I'd be very happy to be involved, but I wanted to co-chair a working group. I just think the days of a sort of white bloke from Britain chairing these things are over, and I did it with a very distinguished woman lawyer from Senegal. We got on very well. We were a group of 12, very balanced from around the world, and we came up with a definition of ecocide, the massive and systematic harm to the environment, whether caused intentionally or recklessly. And now the proposal is that that should be introduced into an amendment of the Rome Statute, the Statute of the International Criminal Court, to basically change public consciousness to make us think more about the environment. And ecocide now is on the cusp, I think, of being taken up. When The Guardian announced that I was going to co-chair the working group, I got WhatsApp messages. We have 3 kids, and they were all in their 20s, and they all WhatsApped me and said, separately, they said, Dad, saw the article in the paper, now finally you're doing something useful. And my work on ecocide, which now continues, is very much motivated by the feeling that your generation really cares about these things. And when you contacted me and said you wanted to talk about ecocide, of course I was going to respond positively. Of course I was going to have this wonderful conversation with you and talk about why I do and what I do. My generation has let your generation down. We've left the world not in a good place. It's not in a good place. And I think we have a responsibility to work with you on improving it and making it better. And one of those areas is in relation to the environment, climate change, ecocide, these kinds of things. So I'm very pleased to be on this conversation with you.
I definitely agree. I think we all owe it to even the next generation to solve or like stop while we still can climate change and what we're doing to the environment. So, like you said, it's kind of a new idea or the adding it of crimes against nature is a new idea. So, how does the concept of justice change when the victim is not a person, but an ecosystem, or even the planet itself, would you say?
So that's a great question. When I started working on the environment in the mid 1980s after the Chernobyl accident, I mentioned to you I'd been to America to give a paper. And while I was there, I met a group of lawyers, wonderful people, who worked for an organization called the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund. They brought cases in the United States for environmental protection. And they gave me an article that was published in 1972. To this day, it's the best law review article I've ever read. It's by an American academic from California called Christopher Stone. And the article was called "Should Trees Have Standing? Towards Legal Rights for Natural Objects." And the idea was that natural objects, a forest, whales and dolphins, the oceans, should be able to go to court to bring proceedings. And very slowly over time, this issue has begun to take root. And Ecuador became the first country to have a written constitution which provided for legal rights for nature. There's been a wonderful book published very recently by the great nature writer Robert Macfarlane, and that book is called "Is a River Alive?" And it looks at the whole question of legal rights for nature, including the question you've asked: how do cases get taken to court on behalf of nature? And he gives examples from 3 different countries, Ecuador and India and a third country, and opens the door, I think, to real work and conversation on legal rights for natural objects.
Wow. I'll definitely be checking out that book. It sounds very interesting. So, if ecocide was made a crime in the international legal world, who would actually be held responsible? Would it be individuals? Would it be corporations? Or would it be states?
Well, the proposal that is doing the rounds right now is on an amendment to the statute of the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court only has jurisdiction over individuals, not corporations and not states. To be honest, I'm rather comfortable with that because it's individuals who take the decision that cause crimes to occur, not governments, not corporations, not states. Individuals are chief executives of corporations and they can be held to account in that way. Individuals are presidents. Mr. Pinochet, for example, who was subjected to the jurisdiction of the English courts, which ruled he didn't have immunity, determined that a case could be brought against him. So the focus is on individuals, and for lots of reasons, some straightforward, some more complicated, I think that is the right way to go.
I think too. So we'll see how later proceedings might see that. So you have obviously written a lot extensively about the origins and the implications of legal definitions of genocide and the challenges it has exposed over time. So when you later participated in efforts of drafting the definition of ecocides, did you take any lessons or any experiences you had in defining it?
Yes, I mean, I've written one book in particular, which actually I get a lot of correspondence from people who are doing actually O levels and A levels. Well, they have a different name now, GCSEs. The book is called East West Street. It was published in 2016, and it talks about how the origins of genocide and crimes against humanity began. They were both invented in 1945, those crimes. And I talk about the role of individuals in making a difference. And that's been a really important thing for me as I do my work, to be inspired by people who took risks, who followed their instincts, who rose to the challenge. And that has inspired me on my work on Ecocide. I mean, I'm not so young anymore. Who knows how many years I have to do the stuff that I'm doing and that I love doing. And that's why I've decided to make the environment and ecocide a central part of what I do. And it draws inspiration from the folks who put climate change and who put crimes against humanity and genocide onto the international agenda. They were called Mr. Lauterpacht and Mr. Lemkin. But also then individuals who put climate change on the agenda in the late 1980s, a subject I've worked on at negotiations for quite a few years. So I'm inspired by the works of others in the past, but I'm under no illusions about the challenge.
Perfect. Well, I think it's always a good thing to take advice from the people from the past because they've lived through life. So, if ecocide became an international crime, what kind of justice would it be possible for communities already devastated in environmental destructions? What would justice look like for them, would you say?
Well, that's a difficult question because, as you know, in law, there's a general principle of non-retroactivity. You can't apply a new law to something that has happened in the past. So we'd have to see about that. Often things are gotten around, we get around those types of issues by saying there are continuing violations. So, for example, the deposit of toxic waste in a community, maybe many years ago, would continue to cause harm today and would subject it to a future crime of ecocide when it was adopted. But in general, the new crimes only apply to acts that happen after the crime is on the statute books. That's the general rule.
Well, let's hope we see some in the future, some prosecutions of individuals who are affecting our climate, who are affecting our planet in quite a negative way. Okay, to end it off now, many of our listeners are sixth formers, students who are early in their careers, maybe want to go into law, maybe want to go into environmental justice and helping climate change. So would you have any advice for them in like finding their path or maybe deciding what law to do?
I would have advice, and maybe it'll be surprising advice. It's the same advice that I've given to my own 3 children with my wife, which is, firstly, follow your instincts. If you're going to go to college, go to university, it's really important that you do something that you love and that really excites you. And to be honest, the law as an undergraduate course is not exciting, is not interesting. It's often pretty dull. As I said to you, I only had one great course. So my general advice is do what you love at university, whether it's physics or chemistry or English literature or history or whatever. And then if you can possibly do it in this way, do the changeover course and then do the law changeover over a year so that you've got the benefit of loving what you do at university. And in my experience, the people who've done other subjects are better prepared for the world of law when they then get into it later. There's no rush. On the other hand, I fully understand that for some people there will be financial constraints, in which case, yes, do law at university, but keep your hand in with other things, history, literature, science. It's very, very important. But follow your instincts. Do what you love and follow that path.
That sounds like very good advice. So do you have any tips for people who might want to follow in a path similar to yours, so into your footsteps in a way of international law or environmental law,
Right.
and any
Right.
tips of like reading recommendations or things like that?
Well, I mean, on on environmental law, as I said, I think you might want to have a read of Robert McFarlane's book, Is a River Alive? And in relation to crimes, international criminal law, I think you should start with East West Street, published in 2016, although you might take a look at my new book, which is called 38 Londres Street, which is about, amongst other things, the trial of Pinochet in London. There are other things that you could do. You know, there was a wonderful watch movies, listen to songs, read poetry, read novels. There was a wonderful film that won an Oscar last year called I'm Still Here, about the disappearance of a man in Brazil in the 1970s and his wife's effort to get justice many years later. What I'm saying is follow your instincts. Don't just double down and just do the law. Read books, read newspapers, watch movies, listen to songs. Go broad in your approach to the law.
Perfect. That's a good note to end this episode today. Thank you so much for coming in and giving us so much good advice and talking about ecocide and international law. It's been a pleasure to have you, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much.
Great.